Well, thanks very much, Sam, and thanks for asking me back. It's always fun to do these, and I think I probably learnt more in the last couple of CPDs at York than I did when I was actually a student at York. But that's that's probably my fault first time round. But also, it's just fascinating to see all the work that's going on. Okay, so just going to move on. I think one of the things is sort of this job for me gets easier each time, because I think one of the things that we can see is that through lots of the presentations, there are some really clear links to things that we do on the A-level. So it's really nice to see that. And I think particularly at the end, where Georgia was kind of showing some of the sort of links to different aspects of regional identity, language attitudes, and things like that, it makes it's really clear to see. And so I think my job's increasingly easy with this. But also it's fascinating to get a glimpse of what's going on and to have a think about the sort of connections that can be made. I think it's also worth thinking about our sort of role as English language teachers at A-level. There's always a core of case studies and research that we come back to as A-level teachers, but I think we can keep adding to that, and we can keep building our own knowledge base as we look at some of the work that's been done here and in previous years. And it's really helpful to see where it all fits in and where we might be able to make links to what we do already. It's also really encouraging, I think, to see how rapidly and effectively teachers and students make use of the material and feed it into their existing work. And while there haven't been any exam papers to mark in 2020 and 2021, at least for examiners who work for exam boards, I know teachers have had to do masses of stuff with CAGs and everything this last year for no extra pay. So that's congratulations to people who've got through that. But we can certainly see that kind of stuff working through in our own students' work. And it's always, I just think it's so encouraging to see students latch onto these ideas so quickly and embed them in the work that they do. So it's great. And I think that, obviously part of that role is teachers coming on things like this and, talking about this kind of work at conferences and on Twitter, for example. So, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I just wanted to sort of talk about before we look at each presentation and think about how each one might be relevant for the A-level, is a sort of broader point as well, really, that, I think as teachers, we really want to help students develop their knowledge and understanding for the A-level, but also, they're not just doing it because of that. They're also doing it because I think, we want them to be active, thoughtful, critical members of society. We want them to be linguists as well, not just in the kind of narrow sense of going to university to study linguistics and language, but to be aware of language around them at all times. And I think as well, for our own self-preservation, both in sixth form colleges and schools with running A-levels, but also in language and linguistics departments, we also need to convince more year 10 and 11 students to take A-level English language. And I think what's really useful about some of today's sessions and those in previous years is that we can relate that work to what's gone before. We can see where it fits in with historic studies and the rest of it. But also, we can see how it strikes out in sort of new and interesting directions. And I think we can also feed that into something we things that we do with our Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 students too, to give them a real taste of language study. I think as well, what's really interesting is, many of these talks allow us to see some different angles. And I think particularly for this year's presentations, I was really grabbed by this sort of idea of social meanings and how important that is to so much of the work that goes on. It opens up some real discussion about the different purposes of language. And I think it perhaps sort of takes us away from one of the sort of more basic and reductive and more obvious views about language, that it's simply about communicating ideas, from one person to another, if you like. And actually that, language is about communicating more than just that. It's about, a conscious understanding of language is maybe sort of signaling identity and communicating things like stance as well. And I think there's also, a lot of reminders today as in the presentations that, the way in which we organise our courses and, the A-level specifications themselves needn't be a kind of straitjacket, needn't restrict us in our discussion of language. There are some really big overlaps between the topics we teach, and that's really worth remembering. And I think, many of the talks today sort of open up those overlaps, and I think show us the sort of bigger picture of language study. Okay, so thinking about the sessions specifically, going back to session 1 with Paul Kurzweil, I thought the main links here were clearly around language diversity and language change. Particularly, I was thinking these are mainly links for sort of AQA, but I think you can see that they translate to other specs too. Paper 2 around language discourses, that's mostly about sort of language attitudes, debates around language, but also, of course, for language investigations for the NEA. And I think, MLE has featured increasingly in work that students have done on language diversity. I think to the extent that it's probably one of the most frequently cited varieties, although it's not strictly a variety, in student responses. So it's clearly captured students' imaginations. And I think the work on MLE has served a really important role in challenging stereotypes around things like, MLE just being slang or being some kind of, broken English or ghetto talk. And I think students are very good at being able to respond to those kind of rather erroneous, prescriptive kind of media representations of it. And as Paul was saying about the sort of, the sort of phasing out of Faken seems to be quite an interesting development. People are much more ready to talk about this as MLE or increasingly, MBE or multicultural urban British English. And I think what's really interesting as well is that, Paul's presentation also shows us a significant language change dimension to this. It illustrates some of the sort of key ideas and processes behind how language changes, e.g., contact and demographics. And I think that's a really important thing to emphasize with students is that, just because they're studying MLE as part of perhaps, language diversity, sociolect, language and ethnicity, like accent and dialect, for example, is not to forget that there's some really interesting dimensions there to change, how change takes place. And they could often use a lot of this in the ways in which they sort of link this through to arguments about, patterns of change. Some connected work, I think, as well, that might be relevant to this. I think the transcripts and audio of Big Zoo and Sophia, which you'll find in the material on the website. And I think, was it Morrison we had an extract from as well. They provide an accessible, engaging way in for students when they're first looking at MLE. So identification of features, but also an understanding of how those features carry social meaning as well and help to convey particular attitudes and aspects of identity. And I think a really, great starter activity for year 12, or even, if we're giving students in years 10 and 11 a taste of language, they can apply these sort of language methods to short stretches of spoken language, and they can have, real focus on how social meanings are created. I think as well, it opens up different sort of avenues for students to explore. And I was kind of struck by one of the points, and certainly this was sort of picked up in a sort of conversation on Twitter while this was going on as well. It was really interesting to see Paul talking about the sort of language heritage and history around MLE and the significance of Caribbean, particularly Jamaican influences. And I think, without kind of dwelling too much on football, although I will a bit later on, of course, is that it's been really interesting thinking about sort of current England team, and obviously the significant sort of prominent role that players of Caribbean heritage have had in that team. But as several people have pointed out, those from an Asian background are almost non-existent. It would be really, really interesting, I think, to explore, with students thinking about their own cultural backgrounds, particularly those, from Asian backgrounds, to have a look at Asian influence on different UK accents and dialects and multi-ethnolects, and to explore those further. So I think it opens up some interesting research projects for students there as well. So moving on to session 2, Paul Drew's session, and I think, referring to the work that he and Annie Irvine have done, I think the main links there, of course, paper 2, language diversity, particularly around occupation. But I thought as well some really interesting links to how we might deal with spoken language with students from the beginning of the course. And again, language investigations. So I think there are some quite obvious links here to the work many teachers would do on language and occupation. So that might be part of, language and social groups, for example. We might already be talking about things like specialist lexis and jargon, institutional genres of talk, that kind of thing, power and relationships in workplace interactions, discourse communities and those kind of ideas. But I think as well, as Paul was illustrating, there's some really interesting work can be done on the structure of occupational talk, the strategies that operate beyond, the word and the utterance level. And we might look at those in other occupations too. And I think, it's really interesting to kind of think about that in terms of, how when we analyze spoken language, and I think I've fallen into this myself with my teaching of it sometimes, is being fixated on the features, is perhaps sometimes to explore how meanings are constructed and co-constructed in interaction, and to think about some of the sort of strategies that are at work. And that was very clear from some of the data that Paul was looking at. I think as well, there are lots of connections to spoken language analysis across the whole course. And I think there were some really nice models there for spoken language work in the NEA, particularly, on the language investigation. We get many students, whatever specification, analysing data from interviews, conversations, debates. And I think that approach modelled by Paul, and in the materials that you can download afterwards, which give you some sort of extension tasks and activities, could be a really excellent way of introducing how you can talk about this sort of AO3 side of things, about meanings and contexts, and the AO1 together, but also how you can weave in some of that AO2 theoretical sort of conceptual knowledge about how spoken language works. And I think as well, that sort of power dimension is really interesting. So there's some good insights there into how power is exerted and resisted through language. If you teach power looking at, at things like instrumental, institutional, influential power, you might see some clear examples in that data that's provided. And I think some really good ways of exploring that in more detail. Okay, so moving on to session 3, and I don't think there'll be any prizes for guessing, which part of the course this is most useful for. Clearly, child language development is the key focus here, but I was particularly taken with the early lexical development, and I just thought that, for someone who's relied very heavily in my teaching on Catherine Nelson's 1973 word lists, I think it will actually, there's some great stuff in what Catherine's talked about that could give us a real sort of up-to-date focus on that, and certainly some of the stuff in a moment we'll have a look at from Word Bank could really help us sort of bring that bang up to date. And we probably need to. I mean, that's quite old now, isn't it? There's 73 stuff. I think as well, what was really interesting as well was this sort of overlaps between lexis and phonology, and I think that's something that's an important thing for students to explore. I don't know exactly how everybody teaches this, but certainly I've tended to take a sort of framework by framework approach, or maybe a sort of stage and framework approach to teaching spoken language development, where I've kind of taught about how sounds are produced one week. I've gone more into kind of words and meanings another week. Thought about sort of syntax in the next stage, a bit of maybe morphology after that, and then pragmatics later on, for example. But I think what's really interesting here is it does show those overlaps. The onomatopoeia is clearly somewhere between words and sounds, and or maybe a bit of both. And I think that then leads us into some other overlaps as well. So areas such as lexis, phonology, and interaction. I thought it was really interesting what Catherine was saying about this sort of quotation from from one of her slides. Both caregivers and children use onomatopoeic words as a way to keep the conversation going. So that importance of interaction and the social meanings again of some of those features of child language, rather than just being sort of focused on what they are and where they are, is looking at what they do and how they can be used. So great if students are analysing data as part of their exam and being able to comment about the meanings within that data. And I think as well, some of the sort of connected work with this, I think some of the guidance in the little video that Catherine's done to go with this as well, talking about how to use Word Bank, that's really, really helpful, very, very clear, very helpful for teachers, I think, if we want to investigate that and prepare our own resources, but great for students too. Useful for sourcing new data examples, but also I think, students could create their own searches from it. And I think, one of the main sort of applications of that would be in language investigations. And I think traditionally, we've tended to see students looking at structures of interaction, but I think it would be really interesting if students looked at maybe a more corpus-based approach. They could explore patterns in data. It wouldn't just be about kind of recording what children are saying in conversation, but maybe exploring, data from other sources and thinking about, the stages that children go through, some of the, the sort of moments that children have in interaction with parents and caregivers. And I think as well, just one sort of fairly simple final point about that is that among all of the topics on the A-level, I think, certainly from my experience, child language development is one where we tend to see the most limited range of reference to case studies and theories. It's generally the sort of old favourites. And we see maybe, a few more recent names crop up. But, I think the work here opens up plenty of sort of new frames of reference. So some ideas there for the third session. And I can't really avoid talking about football. I was thinking with George Bailey's session, really interesting thing that I was just spotted on Twitter this morning. Someone doing a kind of Yorkshire accent for the Yorkshire polo, Calvin Phillips, was a great representation of what he was talking about. And as George was saying, I think one of the things that's really interesting about all of this is its links to language diversity and language change, but also, as he was saying, to spoken language and computer-mediated communication. Many students, will see sort of connections to different parts of the course. I think it would make a brilliant transition activity for Year 11 students to see more of what they could do on the A level and beyond. And I think some really clear connections to language diversity, as George himself was saying. But also that sort of written blended mode inflection we don't often see when we're dealing with language diversity. So I think that's a really interesting dimension to it. I mean, I've tended to stick to teaching around, mostly around the spoken language for diversity, but this gives us some really new and interesting opportunities to discuss other forms as well, other modes. Some connections to language change, and I think technology and language change. As we've often seen, technology has often been associated with dialect leveling, seeing technology is perhaps making us all use the same language, but yet here's technology representing, preserving, spreading non-standard dialects. And as George was saying as well, language discourses, attitudes around technology, decay, decline can be explored too. And I think that sort of opens up some really interesting areas. Just a couple of points on sort of connected work as well. It could be really great to do some of this connected to this on paper 1, so early on in the course, maybe looking at how we use one form of language to represent another. So, how linguists transcribe speech using things like IPA, phonemic symbols, but also how we use iDialect and what that does, how we might interpret that. Language investigations could also come out of this, exploring identity and attitudes. Mini projects could come out of this, I think, in the first year of the course too, leading into longer ones in a second year. Maybe getting students to kind of think about social media and dialect use as an introduction to the kind of work they could do later on. And I was just thinking about some other work that I've seen fairly recently at QMUL by Christian Ilbery. He's focused on how young people interact through WhatsApp group chats and how they represent their own kind of identity and sort of social identity through the language they use. So I think some really clear connections there. And I just thought there's a few kind of useful links there that might help with that. A few ideas around sort of tweetolectology, as some people have called it, Twitterology as well. Some stuff that goes back about 10 years where linguists first started looking at it, but also some more recent ones and some really interesting ones looking at, for example, how African-American speakers and tweeters use it, and some studies of kind of dialect language distribution around the USA and the UK using tweets. Okay, so just to conclude, once again, some masses of material here. There's even more on the website, and I would really encourage you to have a look through that. And the index that Jill has put together has been really, really helpful for sort of mapping what's there to different specifications and topics. It's great to go through that and see some of that. And just thanks very much to University of York linguists for sharing all of this. It's great to see it, and hopefully teachers can make use of it in weeks and months to come. So thanks very much, and I hope that's a useful sort of run through of some of it.